I'm Meredith McBurney, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for Bird Conservancy. And I'm going to start with a few housekeeping tips. First off, we ask that you mute yourself and turn off your video. It will help us run this easier today. And the buttons to do that are in the lower left-hand corner on your screen. You can see they're circled on the slide in green. And let's see, some of you have already started to use the chat box, which is great because that is where we're going to be taking care of questions today. It's on the screen, it's located in the middle. On the bottom, also circled in green. And if you click on that, you'll get a screen that looks like what you see in the far right on the slide that's up. And just type in your question and hit enter, and we will get it. We're going to take most of the questions at the end of the session during the Q&A, but we will be watching the chat box as we go along. And if you have a question or something that needs to be answered right away, we'll do our best to take care of it. Let's see. There's going to be a lot of information packed into the next 2 hours. Many of you have been on these calls before and know that somewhere along the way at about minute 90, your brain begins to explode. We are recording the session. It will be available to you. Probably I'll get it out to you tomorrow. I will also get you to the PDF of the slides so you can just look through the slides for some particular piece of information you're interested in. And we will also pass along any other relevant materials that we discussed today. So I am going to start off. I'm going to give you some information about the cast of characters and today's agenda. Most of you know the people who are presenting today. You've been working with them on the Bald Eagle Project in previous years. And I guess for some of you, I am the newest member to this team. I'm the bander and volunteer coordinator for Bird Conservancy. And I've been the volunteer coordinator for, I don't know, 5 weeks maybe, but have over a decade with Bird Conservancy, running the metro area banding stations. And before that, I was a volunteer working at the banding stations and working on the Bald Eagle Project a long time ago. Anyway, I know firsthand what it's like to be a volunteer with Bird Conservancy, and also how valuable you and the work you do is to our organization and also to the cause of bald eagles. I'm just going to talk briefly about Bird Conservancy. Then I will turn it over to Matt Smith, who's an avian ecologist with Bird Conservancy and the Bald Eagle Program Manager. And he's going to just do a brief refresher on information that you need to recall in order to effectively monitor your bald eagles this season. He will be followed by our wonderful partners from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, who will talk about how CPW is using the data from this project to advance bald eagle conservation. Mike Sherman will start off. He's a wildlife biologist with the Terrestrial Division, and he will talk about bald eagles and land use. And then Risa Conray, an avian researcher, will share info about the really exciting current study on our Front Range bald eagles, telling you about some of the eagles that you may be watching already. Finally, and probably most importantly, Bruce and Jan Snyder are our monitoring coordinators. They assign nests, answer all of your monitoring and reporting questions, great and small, and make sure data entry goes smoothly. They will probably be, after the next week or so, they'll be the people you are in touch with most often. And Bruce is going to talk about the procedure for entering data, all of the changes that have been made, things that you need to know to do this most effectively this year. This is my mandatory slide about Bird Conservancy. Our mission is to conserve birds in their habitat which we do through an integrated approach of science, stewardship, and education. Solid science is required if we are to make good decisions about how to conserve birds. Our stewardship team works with landowners to develop effective measures for conserving habitat based on that science. And our education team uses science to educate and engage students and the general public about birds and their conservation. You folks, as our Bald Eagle Watch volunteers, are really participating in the science work, gathering the data on these birds that help determine what future action will be taken. You may also have had the experience from time to time as acting as both stewards and educators, talking to landowners and other people that you meet while doing your job. I'm getting an echo someplace all of a sudden. Off? Okay. I want to just touch on the fact that we have other volunteer opportunities available. And I want to highlight in particular the education opportunities. If any of you have any interest in working with kids, our future, the next generation of biologists and conservationists, we have school programs and in the field and in classrooms in the spring and the fall. We'll be doing the next batch of training for people for that in March, and to be ready for April and May, which are the busy spring months. It's a great opportunity. It's a lot of fun. And if you're interested, please email me. Okay, volunteering, just some reminders. All of you who have been doing this for some time are already full-fledged volunteers and you don't need to go through the sign-in process. Some of you are going to come up this year for renewal of your background checks. They happen every 3 years and we started this process about 3 years ago. I know a few of you on the call have even had yours updated. So you may get an email from me sometime during the year saying it's time. And again, it's a very easy process and you just respond to an email and that's the last thing you'll probably know about it. But I just want to let you know that may be coming. Remember that you're an ambassador for Bird Conservancy when you're volunteering for us. I check some of my thoughts and ideas at the door, and remember that my job is to represent the organization. And I just wanted to remind you to do it as well. Please feel free to post information about your experience as a bald eagle watcher on your social media. But again, be careful. Remember that social media lives forever, and we want to keep it positive and upbeat. Okay. Volunteering during the time of COVID, I almost ditched this slide, but decided to hold on to it just because. Let's be careful. We don't know what changes are going to take place over the next few months, and we want to try to stay within the CDC guidelines. This is a great job to be doing during a time when you don't want to be mixing in indoors with people you don't know, because most of you are doing this as individuals or with family members and close friends. And it's a wonderful way to get out and be useful and enjoy nature. So just keep all of the basic common sense things about COVID in mind. And finally, I want to talk about your impact. Having just come into this project for the first time in about 15 years, I am just amazed at both what Bird Conservancy volunteers are doing and how much that work is benefiting this overall effort to keep and maintain the great progress that has been made to save bald eagles. Last year, 59 of you, most of you are on this call, provided data that totaled almost 3,000 hours in observing and documenting the breeding behavior of bald eagles in Colorado. Our other speakers today, when you listen to them, you will hear how much difference the data you collect makes. And I just want to emphasize that. And not incidentally, your data, when you put data into SITSI, it records the number of hours that you have spent, and that gets converted into our database as volunteer hours, which is what it is. And all those hours from you and all our other board volunteers come together to create essentially the matching grant for some of our matching money for some of our most important grants. The biggest grant funding the education department at BCR requires a match. And every hour you spend turns into the equivalent of $28 in matching. So not only is your data absolutely critical for bald eagle conservation, but you're really helping bird conservancy. So thank you very much. It's time for me to stop the process stuff and let you get into the substance. So I am going to, we're going to change PowerPoints, and Matt Smith is going to take over. And I'll bet you he'll do a brief introduction as I'm doing that.
Thank you, Meredith. Yes, hi, I'm Matt Smith, avian ecologist with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And I've been with the organization since the winter of 2016. And I managed the Bald Eagle Watch project. That's what I was originally came to Bird Conservancy for, and now I do a lot with our integrated monitoring and bird conservation regions program, as well as continuing to be involved with Bald Eagle Watch. And I'm going to talk a little bit, just pretty briefly about some important points regarding timing of monitoring, since this is our returning volunteer session, and we had our new volunteer session this morning. We're not going to rehash all of that natural history information, just going to focus on the timing of your visits and why those are important.
And you're
okay, I'm on. Here we are. Great. So if we could go ahead and advance to the next slide. So those key, really important dates that we want to capture during monitoring of the nesting season is that beginning of incubation, if that's possible. So that's possibly before now, mostly not, mostly around the beginning of February. So we've got time to get out there and get the beginning of incubation, and the hatch date, if it can be captured, is super important, especially if we don't have a good idea of exactly when incubation started. Those other data points like hatch date and fledging can help us backdate so that we can get an idea of when that nest was actually initiated. And then a really crucial thing we want to keep track of here is fledging. And so there are two metrics by which we measure the success of a nest, and that's whether the eaglets reach at least 8 weeks old, at which time their body size is about 90% of the adult, or that they are capable of coordinated sustained flight, which you might see by either them actually flying, or that they are perched in a nearby tree and appear to have left the nest of their own power. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So the timing here, this is kind of a graph of reported behaviors adjusted for the number of visits over the course of the nesting seasons from 2016 to 2019. And so what we're really seeing is we're seeing a lot of the incubation February through March, and nestlings present starting in kind of early March, but we're really see that ramp up observations that include nestlings through April, and then May is when we start to see eagles fledging and beginning to leave the nest. So you see there's a lot of overlap there, and it can vary significantly from one nest to another. individual pairs of eagles tend to lean in one direction or another as far as their nesting timing, but that can also vary by up to a few weeks, depending on the season. Things like the availability of open water and things like that may have an effect on when they actually get serious about laying eggs and making a reproductive effort. So now more fine scale timing considerations. Morning and evening are best. So a little bit after sunrise, a little bit before sunset. That first hour and last hour of the day are when you will typically see the most activity from the birds coming and going from the nest. So if you're having a hard time determining whether a nest is active, getting out there early in the morning or in the evening in the last hour of daylight can be your best opportunity to see some activity there. And ideally, we'll be visiting weekly throughout the season, but we're looking for at least 2 visits per month during the nesting season and for an hour each visit. Life gets busy. It can be difficult sometimes to give a whole hour to that. And I recognize also that the hour that you're watching the nest isn't the limit of the time that you're devoting to that activity that day. Travel, preparation, those things count as well. So, and keep that in mind when you're recording your volunteer hours, by the way. So preparation that you do to get ready to go to the nest, your travel time, your observation time, all those things count. If you're visiting a nest more often, shorter visits you can kind of get away with better. But sometimes, 15 minutes, a half an hour may not be quite enough time to get a real sense of what's going on in that nest, because periods of activity can be short and spaced out depending on the stage of nesting that we're at. Next slide, please. So again, these are our critical moments. We want incubation, hatching, that 8-week survival milestone, and fledglings observed. So outside of the nest or capable of coordinated sustained flight. So those are the really important things we're looking for, and that we want to keep track of, because that's what really helps us determine the success or failure of a nest during the nesting season. So with that, I think that's it for me. And it's time for me to turn it over to Mr. Mike Sherman of Colorado Parks and Wildlife.
Sound, you're off. You're muted, Mike.
There it is, thanks. Good afternoon. I'm Mike Sherman with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I see a lot of familiar names on the meeting here, and welcome to new folks. I am a wildlife biologist with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I work out of Fort Collins, been there about 25 years, and I work mainly across Larimer, Boulder, and Weld counties. And I work often on non-game species, including raptors, bats, black-footed ferrets, some big game animal work, and also a lot of work with industry and working on land use and development on the Front Range. Next slide, please. I'm going to reiterate a little of some of the information maybe Matt had gone over as well. I'll say that I've worked with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies for the past 25 years since I've been on board, and your organization has been monitoring bald eagles for at least 30 years, especially along the Front Range and now more even statewide. CPW and BCR has partnered for decades, had a really successful relationship. And as I'll get into, CPW really relies on BCR volunteers for this work. Regarding bald eagles, the bald eagle was listed as an endangered bird, then switched to being a threatened bird. This is federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife protection status. That was in 1995. And then the bird came off of this species came off of the federally threatened list in 2007. It still is protected by two major federal pieces of legislation, the Bald and Golden Protection Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Those are administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You can read about them more online. I will send up in the chat a link to a Fish and Wildlife Service eagle management website that's got a lot of great information. In addition to those two federal pieces, forms of protection that are there. And by the way, the main thing to take home from that is that birds cannot be harassed, or parts of the bird, the eggs, the nest cannot be really messed with at all. The eagle nests, as opposed to any other raptor nests, are protected year round. So eagle nests cannot be taken down or destroyed year round, even when they're not being used, versus other species of raptors. The nest can be taken down when the birds are not using them. Back to Colorado Parks and Wildlife's document. It's called Recommended Buffer Zones and Seasonal Restrictions for Colorado Raptors. That 2008 document was revised in 2020. And CPW uses this to routinely make recommendations on ways to avoid and minimize disturbance to nesting, wintering, and resident raptors in Colorado. That document's available online. But just the main point is that Parks and Wildlife has this document and we make recommendations. It does not hold any teeth per se. That's where the Fish and Wildlife Service's jurisdiction comes in. Parks and Wildlife role is really to make recommendations to try to avoid and minimize impacts. Next slide, please. As you know, Colorado's Front Range landscape's rapidly changing, populations increasing tremendously. I invite everybody to go to the state of Colorado's demographer's website to take a look at some really interesting information about the number of people moving into Colorado, where they're coming from. The bottom line is, I think in the next decade, it's forecasted that about 75% of the growth in Colorado is going to be on the Northern Front Range. In addition to that, bald eagle numbers are also increasing, especially along the Front Range. I think eagles we had about a half dozen to 10 nests known in the 70s, and now we've got well over close to 250 nests statewide that are known. And I think BCR is monitoring over half of those. There's probably another 100 to 200 nests that are out there in the state that we don't know about. But the bottom line here is that bald eagle numbers are increasing in an area where people are increasing. And so there's bound to be some sort of conflict along the way. CPW consults on project proposals, including aggregate mining for sand and gravel, energy development, oil and gas, solar arrays, housing, commercial building developments, highway projects, bridge replacements, regional recreational trails for hiking, biking, off-road vehicles. I spend a lot of my time doing these consults with industry and trying to, again, avoid and minimize impacts from project proposals that are near nests. Now, regarding near nests, Parks and Wildlife, part of our recommendations are to have a buffer around bald eagle nests from December 1 through July 31st. December 1 is the beginning of the breeding season, when adults are forming nest pairs often and bonding. We see copulation, courtship, and nest building. And then usually by the end of July, young have fledged. And we consider that the end of the nesting season. The take-home message here, we've got two sort of recommendations. Parks and Wildlife's document recommends a no surface occupancy within a quarter-mile radius of active nests, surface occupancy being defined as any physical object that's intended to remain on the landscape permanently for a significant amount of time, including houses, oil and gas wells, oil and gas tanks, wind turbines, solar developments, roads, tracks, trails, etc. So we really recommend that permanent structures don't go in within a quarter mile of a nest when these project proposals arise. And then secondly, there's a half-mile radius recommendation around active nests. And there we recommend no human encroachment activities that bring humans into that half-mile radius. And those might include construction activities, again, oil and gas, vehicles driving, facilities maintenance, boating, trail access, etc. So CPW has these recommended buffer guidelines that are fairly conservative in an effort to try to minimize and avoid impacts. Our recommended buffers are more extensive and at a greater distance from the nest, 1.5 mile, than the National Bald Eagle Management Guidelines, due to the fact that in the Western US, we generally have more open landscapes and we're concerned with sort of line of sight, whereas in other parts of the country where there might be more wooded areas, encroachment might do okay coming up even closer to the nest. That's why Fish and Wildlife Service has a recommendation of 660 feet approximately. Next slide, please. Again, kind of getting into the weeds here a little bit. I'll let you read that. Our recommended buffer guidelines are just recommendations. And I spend, like I said, a lot of my time working with energy development, housing development, especially recreation trails, off-road highway trails. And when I see a project proposal, first thing we do is we put on the map the bald eagle nests that we find, that you find, that we're monitoring. We have the data from those, and we put a 1/4 mile radius and a 1/2 mile radius. And then we start having a discussion about how these project proposals can either avoid being in those areas or work around them seasonally outside the nesting season. I do a lot of consults with industry, especially oil and gas in northern Colorado. Weld County has a tremendous amount of oil and gas development, a lot of new roads, a lot of new trails. I spend probably half my time reviewing project proposals and submitting formal comment letters and recommendations. And that includes a lot of negotiation on the ground. We try to work things out with industry, with local agencies that want to put in trails, with housing developments. I try to work out a negotiation with them. Each nest, each project proposal is different. And we try to avoid getting Fish and Wildlife Service involved in that if possible. They're very understaffed. I work closely with them and I kind of work as their eyes and ears on the ground. And then you are my eyes and ears on the ground, often BCR and CPW in terms of our observation and the data that we're collecting on these nests. I'll just point out that over the last 3 decades, BCR has done a fantastic job refining the protocols for collecting data, for the observations that you're doing, and then especially for the database that all that data goes into. Bruce and Matt have spent a lot of time refining that database. That database automatically at the end of the year, once it's been quality controlled with your data, goes into CPW's statewide raptor nest database. So the bald eagle data is a portion of the statewide database. That database is accessible from environmental consultants, from industry, and they look at that database regularly and they map that out with their project proposals and try to avoid our 1.5 mile buffers. If they can't, then that's when sort of consults are triggered, and that's when I come into play and we start talking about what we can do to try to minimize. But the important part is that the data you're collecting goes into this database at BCR, then into the state, and it is used by industry. And so I can't stress the importance of it. With 160 or so odd nests that BCR is monitoring this year, it's just priceless information to have, very valuable. We do not have the staff at CPW to monitor all those nests in the detail that BCR does, and greatly appreciate your efforts and your time, and look forward to working with you and hopefully meeting some of you and spending time in the field. That's all for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah.
Lisa, we're turning it over to you.
Okay, thanks. I'm Risa Conry and I'm an avian researcher. I work out of Fort Collins in the CPW office there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research study, and I know you guys are returning volunteers, so I'll just go quickly through the early stuff because you probably heard me talk about this last year. And Mike did a good job covering some of this stuff as well. Next slide, please. So I think Mike already made a good case for why we need the information. So I'll just draw your attention to the graph on the bottom. So this is a graph of the known nests that are in CPW's statewide raptor nest database. And so it does not necessarily reflect all nests. In fact, we know it doesn't include all nests. It's an index rather of the nests in the state. So the blue are the statewide numbers, and then the red are the northern Front Range counties that are included within our study area for this research project. So that would be from South Denver all the way north to the Wyoming border, and then from kind of the Boulder area along the foothills until you get east around Greeley. And so you can see the really rapid increase in bald eagle nests that Mike talked about that has occurred at the same time that the Front Range human population has also expanded quite a bit. Next slide. So the main objective is the same as I mentioned last year. It's to assess our bald eagle population and their trends, and also how they're using habitat in this rapidly changing human-dominated landscape of the Front Range. So first, estimating breeding success over time, and that's where your observations are super important. So nest initiation, we consider to be when they lay the first egg and begin incubating that first egg. And so,
Sorry.
that's okay. And so that's likely to be happening pretty soon. And so, you know, the sooner you guys can get out there and start observing, the better for us. Because what I really like to see is when you have one observation where you can tell they're not incubating yet, and then the next one they are incubating, because then I can find that midpoint, and that's really helpful for us. Also nest survival. So when at least one fledgling is known to survive and leave the nest. And then fledging success being the number of eaglets that actually fledge from a nest. So your observations are forming a huge part of this part of our objective. Second, quantifying human-related disturbance. Again, your observations are great. Particularly, we want to know what the disturbance type is. Is it people hiking on a trail? Is it construction equipment or what have you? And then how the eagle responds. So I know we said this last year that if their response is nil, is nothing, if they don't even turn their heads and they appear to ignore it, we really want to know that, because it's super important for us to be comparing urban versus rural sites, birds that have been in that area for a long time versus new nests, and how they respond to different types of disturbance, and how some birds are perhaps very tolerant and habituated to certain kinds of disturbance that they're used to, and the types of things that they're not habituated to. And then the other piece of this is spatial analysis. So we've got a collection of spatial layers, and we're still in the process of doing this, looking at current and historic land use and how that compares to where our bald eagle nests are on the landscape and what their success level is. And then the third piece of it is what I'll spend most of my time on today. So it's analyzing movements in habitat use of birds at more urban versus more rural sites, and all along that gradient in between. So when I spoke to you last year, I think we only had 2 transmitters successfully put on birds, and now we have 20 on, and we're hoping to get 25 to 30 altogether. So we've got we've had 2 mortalities. I'll talk about that in a bit. So we're hoping to get another 10 to 12 transmitters on eagles this summer. And then the overall goal, of course, is to inform conservation and land management to benefit our bald eagle population and to help us give the best guidance and advice we can, like Mike Sherman said. And so both peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals, as well as more informal publications, presentations. We've given a bunch of those already and plan to keep doing that just to spread the word and provide information where we can, to collaborate with all of our partners, including cities and counties, open spaces, as well as to contribute to news media and social media. Next slide, please. So this shows an early draft of the development index, and it was based on these 7 layers that I've got listed below the figure. So oil and gas, solar energy, wind energy, power transmission lines, recreational trails, roads, and then residential and commercial development. And this is still being refined, but what you see here is a decadal look at the Front Range, at our study area that's outlined there with that faint white line. And so the more light colored the pixel, the more developed, the higher the development index for that pixel. And so as you look from 1990 to 2020, you can see a lot more lighter colored pixels on the map, and that tells you that the Front Range was getting developed, which is no surprise over that period. And then the white dots are the bald eagle nests, and so you can just see that more of those nest sites are now in a highly developed area than they were earlier on. And this is something that we're going to continue to work on. In fact, we've got a graduate student starting who's interested in continuing with these spatial analyses. So I think that's going to be a really important part of this study. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we've gotten 20 transmitters on now, which was a huge relief to me when last year at this time I was talking about only 2 transmitters on birds, but we did a lot better last summer. So especially between May and August, when the nests had these sort of growing teenage eaglets that perhaps were putting more stress on their parents to keep them fed, they were more likely to come down to our baits. So we got most of our transmitters on during that kind of mid to late summer period. So the GSM stands for Global System for Mobile Communications. So these transmitters are pinging off of cell towers, and that allows them to be smaller and lighter weight. And so there you see Mike Sherman releasing one of the birds near Fort Collins. And you can make out that little rectangle on its back, that's the transmitter. And the part that's facing upward is completely covered in a solar panel. So that's how they stay powered. And it's attached to the bird via a backpack type of harness. So out of those 20 birds we have tagged, 16 are adults. So we tagged 9 males and 7 females. 14 of those 16 were breeders. 2 of them ended up being non-breeders. We thought when we caught them that they were the breeding adults, but those 2 we both caught in the fall, and it turned out that we had wintering birds. So we realized that really quick when they immediately took off and flew someplace else when we released them. We've got 1 subadult male. He's probably a 4-year-old male that we put on when USDA had that bird in hand anyway, and we had a transmitter that needed to go on a bird. He was caught near Denver International Airport, and they wanted the bird to be released somewhere away from the airport because of flight strike risk. And then we got 3 juveniles. So these were birds that were post-fledge, and they were trapped on the ground just like we trapped the adults. So 1 male and 2 females. So they are intended to stay on for 2 to 5 years. That harness I mentioned, the backpack harness, is made with a breakaway on the breast of the bird. So over time, we expect that it will deteriorate and the transmitters will come off. And that's on purpose because bald eagles can live in the wild even for quite some time, up to 30 years, and we don't need them to be wearing these backpacks for that whole time. But we're hoping that we'll get ideally at least 5 years of data out of them. And the way these transmitters work, it's not constant updates. I don't get constant live updates. So the sacrifice that we make for the smaller size and the lighter weight is that we only get those locations once a day. So they're constantly taking locations and storing them on the device throughout the entire 24-hour period. They're storing them, but they don't get sent to my data portal to where I can see them until the time that I stipulate every 24 hours. So Right now, that's 9:30 every morning. I find out where all my birds have gone. And the number of fixes we get, I can also set based on how well my battery is holding up. So in the wintertime, when we have fewer hours of sunlight and the sun is at a more oblique angle, I have to ratchet that down a little bit and we get fewer locations. So in the summertime, for a lot of these transmitters, they perform well enough that I can get fixes about every 4 seconds while the bird is moving. Whereas in the wintertime, some of them I've had to turn down to just once per hour, but that's still pretty good in a lot of locations. Next slide, please. So a few things that we've learned are that the breeding adults are resident year round. And for those of you who go out to your nests in the winter, that's probably not a huge surprise to you, but it can be tough. At some of these sites where we get a lot of wintering birds, it can be hard to tell which birds you're looking at. So the transmitters have shown us that particularly the males are resident just about all year. Both breeding adults and especially the females will take a hiatus, which could be just a few days up to a few weeks from their front range nesting territories, typically in late summer or early fall. And all of our birds thus far that have done this have either gone west or southwest into the mountains or north into Wyoming. And so some birds do that and some birds don't. We have others that are real homebodies and almost never go more than 5 kilometers or about 3 miles away from their nests. And it's a different story for the non-breeders. Both the 2 adults, the subadult, and the 3 juveniles have ranged a lot more broadly. So most of them have gone up into Wyoming as opposed to going east, west, or south. Some haven't gone any farther than Wyoming. One in particular went a super long distance, and I'll show you her data in a bit. The graph or the map on the right shows where all of the birds were about a week ago, with the exception of one. So we have one juvenile female that's still in Nebraska right now, but the others are all shown here. And out of those 20 birds, we're still watching 18 of them. 2 of them were lost to mortality events, which isn't a huge surprise. Unfortunately, one of our adult females got electrocuted when she tried to land on a power pole that wasn't bird safe. In the intervening time, that pole has been retrofitted. And then one of the juvenile females, we were able to recover and necropsy from Wyoming. She died just outside of Laramie, Wyoming. And it was found that West Nile virus was the cause of death, with sublethal lead levels being perhaps a contributing factor. And so the transmitter that you see in the middle picture is the original one that we started off putting on birds. So we have 4 of these that are deployed right now, and then the technology improved even further and the transmitters got even a little bit smaller than they were. So they're now down to about the transmitter plus the harness being about 1% the body weight of an adult male. And the males are smaller than their females by probably 20–25%. So I think that they're working pretty well and they're working as we expected. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of what the data look like when I've got the fixes ratcheted all the way up to get up to that 4-second locational data. This is an adult male whose territory is in the Denver metro area. And you can see Bruce releasing that male. So the map on the right shows you what his data looked like for 2.5 days worth. And so he's returning back to his nesting territory a lot, but you can see where he's gone to forage. This is just a slide, so I can't zoom in obviously, but if we could zoom in, you would see that it's kind of easy to tell where he was perched and where he was staying for an extended period of time, as opposed to which areas are just in his flight path from point A to point B. But both the perch areas as well as the flight paths, I think, will be informative in terms of where those foraging areas are and what kinds of landscape features those birds may be using as they move from foraging to nesting site back and forth, and which areas they might be avoiding. Next slide. And then this is kind of the opposite case, about as different as you could get from that male. So this is the juvenile female that I was mentioning is still in Nebraska right now. So about 1 week after we tagged her, in early July, she took off and went north. And within 5 days, she had gone from her natal area all the way up to the US-Canada border. And then another 5 days after that, she was halfway up, right around the border between Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and ended up around Lake Winnipeg. And then for 2.5 months, we lost track of her entirely because she had gone outside of cellular range. So presumably there aren't a lot of cell towers up there. And so we didn't get any data for that whole period and didn't know what was happening with her until she called in again at the very end of October. And then it took her, once she left that area around Lake Winnipeg, it took her 14 days to get to the US-Canada border. And then in a much more leisurely way than her northward journey, she made her way south again, took her time in South Dakota, made her way down through Nebraska, all the way down Kansas, almost into Oklahoma. And then she circled back up through Southeast Colorado and Kansas and has been in Nebraska for probably 5 or 6 weeks now. Next slide. So as Mike said, we use the data collected by volunteers. So from my perspective, as a researcher, all the nest and the fledging success information are calculated from the observation data that you guys collect. And also you guys have been a big help in facilitating us with trapping. So helping us determine where we should try to trap, which nest sites, which locations within those territories. You've helped with property access. You guys have helped us figure out the timing. So we won't trap while the birds are incubating, and we won't trap while they have nestlings that are less than 5 weeks old, just because we'd be concerned about thermoregulation. Typically, we see that if we have one of the adults getting trapped, the other adult, if the nestlings are young enough, the other adult is on the nest again. But just to be safe, we're avoiding that time for trapping. So your observations are really helpful for that. So, again, just to emphasize, dates when incubation begins, hatch dates, fledge or fail dates. A lot of that can be gleaned from the behavioral observations you guys record. So when you record an adult appears to be incubating or brooding, or we saw nestlings being fed, that's super helpful. The aging that you guys do is very helpful. So, typically between, the really tiny downy nestlings that you see for the first 2 weeks up until about 8 weeks, hopefully you guys can age those. I know once they get to that point, it gets a little bit hard to tell a 9 from a 10 from an 11-week-old. But all that can be backdated or forward dated if you guys have kind of helped us get those important points noted. And then again, the potential disturbances and how the bird responds, even if that turns out to be nothing. Perch locations, you guys have been great at telling us where heavily used perches are, because often we're going to set a trap really close to that perch. So we started being a lot more successful when we started sticking the baits and the traps kind of right under their noses. And so as you can see from the aerial photo and then the ground-based photo that's right below it, we had somebody note where the nest was and where the perches were, and also where the vegetation was low enough. We're not going to set in areas that are really shrubby or have kind of a lot of tall grasses or crop stubble, because the birds just don't see, they just don't see the traps and they don't see the baits in those situations. So this kind of information is also really, really helpful. And keep in mind that some of those perches might be within your line of sight. Sometimes they're not. And even if you say, well, I don't know exactly where he's perching all the time, but he always flies, east from here, that might still be helpful information for us. And then just any information you have about potential sources of disturbance and infrastructure is useful for us. Next slide. So I just want to say thanks. to all of you guys. I mean, it's really integral data for my research study and more broadly for CPW as we try to do a good job with management and providing advice to all of our many partners, folks who are trying in good faith to avoid disturbing nests. You know, your data is useful for just so many reasons. And if you want more information about the project, we did put out a press release on July 13th. So what you see on the left is just a screenshot from that press release. You can get there by just typing into Google or whatever your favorite search engine is, CPW Bald Eagle Study. And typically the first thing that comes up is our press release. And so there's some text there. You see a picture of Bruce again releasing one of our eagles. Also, the first link that's there is a link to a podcast where Matt and Mike Sherman and I all spoke in that podcast. And then there's also a video about the research project in there and some other information. So just thanks again. I mean, everything you guys do is super important, and we couldn't do even a tiny fraction of the research without you. That's it for me.
Thank you, Risa. Bruce, oops. You don't have a,
Here.
yeah, good.
Hi, folks. As many of you know, I'm the nest monitoring coordinator for the Bald Eagle Watch program. And what I'd like to do today is discuss the nest monitoring process and the data reporting specifics, particularly now that we've started with a new data sheet and new data capturing process with the CSU CITSI Bald Eagle Watch website. Some of you will be seeing the same information that was presented this morning. And the reason I'm doing that is because many of our current volunteers probably have not had an opportunity to get into the new software for CITSI. And so I wanted to make sure that folks who haven't had an opportunity to do that yet do get an overview of the basics and how to work with that website. The details that you see in the slides will be posted to the Google Groups website, and hopefully within a couple of weeks, we'd like to do a live demo that works through the entire data sheet and the different options, and to address more of the nuts and bolts questions that you may have. Regarding that, today, what I would like you to think about, for those of you who have gotten into the new version of CITSI and worked with it a little bit, if you have questions or uncertainty about certain aspects of that website, today would be a good opportunity at the end of the presentation to discuss some of those and maybe make it easier for you to work with it. Lastly, I'd like to say that the observers that we have are great. You've provided a lot of information. And as you can see here from the map on the screen, we're showing from last year, we're showing about 201 monitored nests. And those include mostly occupied nests for breeding bald eagles, but these points also include alternate nests, and they include some historical nest locations that have were active in the past that have since disappeared, just been destroyed, fallen down.
Bruce, did I lose you? You appear to be muted.
I'm back. I'm unmuted.
And you want the next slide?
No. Go back to the previous.
Okay,
Please.
sorry. Okay,
So reiterate just quickly, we had about 201 nests monitored last year. It included alternate nests, destroyed nests, etc. Of that, we had 158 nests that were occupied by breeding adults. And of that, we had 133 nests that produced at least one young. So as you can see from this graphic, the nest, our program extends along the South Platte River corridor all the way out to Sterling, extends northward to the Wyoming state border. To the west, it follows primarily the Colorado River corridor and some of its tributaries. And to the south, we have a small pocket of active nests down in the along the Arkansas River corridor. So what we are hoping to do is recruit new members for helping us cover the northwest part of the state and the southwest part of the state and some areas of the southeastern part of the state. So if you have friends or colleagues who you've talked to who may be interested in doing this, or who may be participants in other Bald Eagle Watch programs that might be interested in contributing to the Bald Eagle Watch program, we'd encourage you to talk with them and put them in touch with us. I just want to point out that there's no problem with people who are involved in other Bald Eagle Watch programs contributing to Bald Eagle Watch as well. So I know there are a lot of other smaller groups who are looking at nest monitoring the bald eagle. There's quite a wide variety of groups looking at these birds all the time. So just put that out there for your consideration. Next slide, please. What I wanted to do is to give you folks a little bit of information from last year's results here. I've updated this monitoring trend slide from last year. And basically what we're seeing here is that the number of new nests recorded last year was 36. That's not total nests, that's new nests that are added to the inventory since the 2020 nesting season. We increased the number of breeding pairs to 158. The number of productive nests increased. The number of nests that were destroyed, failed, or abandoned stayed about the same as they were last year. So I just wanted to give you that feedback to give you an overview of what you contributed to last year's monitoring effort. Next slide, please. Also wanted to just give you some feedback on what we learned from the 2021 monitoring season. The guidelines that we have a screenshot of the cover worked very well because the Bald Eagle Watch SitSci software has changed. We've gone ahead and updated the guidelines to reflect the changes in the structure and the processes involved in the new version 2 of the SitSci software. So I want to hit a couple of highlights on that a little bit later. But as you can see from the information, we increased our total number of observations during the nesting season to about 2,700 observations. And there's probably close to 3,000 observations now in the database for the calendar year 2021 because of observations that have been added post nesting, which those kinds of observations are very important as well, as Risa and Mike and Matt referred to earlier. One thing that we found particularly important was the appendix in our guidelines that have photos of the young eaglets at various age intervals, 1 week intervals. And as Risa pointed out, that's very, very important information, very, very useful information for helping everyone back calculate to determine overall population productivity, survival, and so forth. The guidelines were very, very helpful in helping us to reduce data entry errors. And we've focused more on that this year with our guidelines for the simple reason that when data goes in a, I'll call it a weird format, it takes time to go back through the database and clean up those values so that they're useful for data analysis. So the more we can remove the errors on putting them in, the less time we have to spend at the back end cleaning up the information and doing quality control checks. So next slide.
Oops.
Okay, so overview, what were the reporting changes that we made or that were made from the SITSI form and process in 2021 to the SITSI process in 2022. I'd like to just hit on some of the bigger changes. The most important one was the update to the user interface. We think it's probably now easier to get your data, to get the data in and to locate information about nest sites that has been added in the past. If you have been experiencing problems or difficulties working with the database, I'd certainly like to hear about it because we can work with the developers to address those issues and make things work more efficiently and smoother. The second biggest change has been the addition of an edit function, which means we can go back now very much easier than we could previously and make changes in the data sheets that you realize, oops, wrong date entered or wrong location entered. That whole edit function process is now much smoother. We've added in the guidelines the a table of the 10 most common errors that occur when adding information, along with solutions on how to address those. For you folks that have been contributors for many, many years, one thing that you want to pay particular attention to now in the WIN code column, it used to be a 6+ choice. We've changed that to 7. So just be aware of that. And that 7 is now a drop-down box choice, and it means the same thing as 6+. We've got required fields, which are now, I think, probably the third most important change. And what that means is you need to add information for those fields before you can proceed further or before you can save your observation record. And those required fields are particularly addressing the number of adults, nestlings, and fledglings that are observed each nest observation period and the hours donated by the volunteers. And remember, those hours donated means more than just the time that was spent looking at the nest. As Matt referenced earlier, you can include in that traveling back and forth to the nest, the observation time at the nest, the time required to put the information into SITSI or into the Google Groups site. And if there were more than one observer who's a registered volunteer, you can multiply the observation time by the number of volunteers that made the observation. Okay. We put an added emphasis on identifying the types of temporary disturbances that might occur at a nest. So there are more options for doing that. And in addition to that, we're asking to have volunteers make an estimate of how far from the nest to the disturbance, how far that distance was. So we've added some additional choices to a couple of these fields that you see on here. Last, on the nest status condition, we've added a new option called partial collapse, and that's intended to capture those cases where a nest kind of falls apart on one side or the bottom, but doesn't completely disappear. And what we've observed many times is the adults will come back at the end of the nesting season or at the beginning of the new nesting season and repair those nests. They still continue to use that. So we're trying to capture that additional information from your observations. one point here, the SITSI database is now available not only in a PC version, but it's available to access by smartphone or iPhone, either through your web browser or through the specific app that you can download from the SITSI site. Next slide, please. Here on the image on the left is the cover of the new revised guidelines. It's just a little bit longer than the previous version of the guidelines. And what we've added is some getting started information, because we observed that there were numerous issues with people being able to get into SITSI, and hopefully we got those issues resolved. But we still took the time to put together a step-by-step for getting into SITSI for the first time. Along that lines, I just wanted to mention to you returning volunteers that around mid-June, when the system was switched to version 2, you should have received an email that said you need to reset your password and to create a new account. Hopefully, most of you have done that. And if you're having problems getting into SITSI now, haven't been there for a while, the first thing I would look at is see whether or not you've created that account and been issued or created a new user password, which I think is a minimum of 11 characters that you need to use. So these guidelines, I think you would be well served to take a look at them the first time. The appendix with the nestling age photos is still there. The table with the 10 most common data entry areas is provided. And we will post these guidelines on both the Google Groups website and on the SITSI resources tab for your convenience. Let's see, let's go to the next slide, please. I'll start now with the web resources, and I'll focus primarily on the, first of all, on the SITSI database is on the left. This is the tool that we use for getting the detailed information and data for the nest observations recorded and preserved. The image on the right is our Google Groups Bald Eagle Watch forum, and this is used primarily for community discussions, observing or recording things of interest, questions and answers, just things of general interest. And at the top, we have a section that gets into various parts of the website where we can provide additional information on nest locations, field data sheets, and other similar information. So I'd like to go, one thing for potentially new people joining the meeting. The location of each one of these two sites is shown at the top with the URL or the web-based address. And you need to be a registered user of Bald Eagle Watch before you can get to either one of these two sites. So let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, when we go down through the Bald Eagle Watch SITSI tool, there are 3 tabs of particular interest. There's the Add Data tab, the blue button. There's the Data tab, which gives you access to all the previous records and current records. And there's a Resource tab, which provides you access to support information. And down to the lower right, you see that when you click on the blue Add Data, another button will show, which is the Nest Site Visit Form. which is what you want to click to go to the nest site visit. In the future, we anticipate some additional forms, and once those get done and checked and so forth, when you click on add data, those will show as a selection option as well. So next slide. Okay, this is what the new blank data sheet looks like for the SITSI version 2. I couldn't show all of the data sheet because it's pretty long. We've got about 45 fields. So I just captured the upper part of the form, and the major parts of the form is the observation date and nest location, information on the eagles that were observed, counted, and what their behaviors are. The condition of the nest, was it occupied, unoccupied, intact, destroyed, etc. Information on habitat conditions and human disturbances, and a place to post photographs of your visit if you care to submit those. The process is to open this data sheet, record the information, and save the data sheet by clicking submit at the end. So next slide, please. This shows the same initial part of the data sheet. And as all of you who have participated in the past are aware, each nest has a unique ID code, and we want to make sure that we get the right nest in the location field, because there are now many similar sounding nest codes, or we have nest codes for nests that are quite close together. So it's easy to make an error if you're not careful. So you can see down below, we have the fields, are required fields for number of adults and so forth, and the field for aging the eaglets. And then at the below that, we have the beginning of the fields that collect information on the behaviors of the eagles that you observed while you perform that nest visit. As we pointed out before, we really do want to try to capture the age of the nestlings, especially the time when you first sight a young eaglet, or when you see the adults engaged in behaviors, looking down, staring into the nest, that strongly suggests that there are eaglets there, but they're too small to be seen because of their small size and the large size of the nest. So in the guidelines, we've got suggestions on how to record those types of circumstances. When we go through a live demo, we can deal with that in more detail. Looking at these fields here, you'll see a kind of a smaller font, light gray. Those are hints. And even if one chooses not to look at the data entry guideline document, these hints provide you with some guidance on what answers, or how to characterize what you see and transform those into an answer, or to select an answer that comes down in the drop-down box. And at this point, because we are dealing with you folks that have been here before, what I would like to emphasize is that you really should, first 1 or 2 times you go through this data sheet, you really should look at the hint, because some of the definitions have changed from last year. And based on last year's experience, we've got some notes in those hints that say, here's what you ought to be looking for if you anticipate using this answer. And a classic example of that is the branching behavior. We quite a few times last year, we had branching behavior identified for adult eagles. And if you look at the guidelines and you look at the hints, that branching behavior should be applied 2 young birds that have moved beyond the nest and into branches near the nest. So that's something that, the quality control check that I do and Matt does, we're looking for things like that. And if we can catch those before they get entered, it just makes the whole time spent doing quality control and data a lot more efficient and a lot shorter. So just a word for me. Next slide, please. This is just a quick slide for you to just be aware that it may not be intuitive when you first look at this data sheet, that the observation date field, you should click in that because the default setting is going to be the day that you open this in. And as I've said before, the observation date is the date that you observe the nest, not the day that you enter the data into the data sheet. So when you click on that field, you'll get a drop-down calendar and you pick from that calendar and the dates entered for you. And just take a second, look at that, make sure it's the right date before you move on. Likewise, in the location field, when you click on that, you'll get a drop-down list of all the nests that are in the nest inventory with the nest ID code and the nest name. And as you can see in this example, there are similar names and codes. So when you go through this field, just be careful, check and make sure you're putting the right nest location in this field. Next slide, please. Once you've entered all the information and click submit on the previous form, you'll be taken to this form, which is basically showing what information was recorded during that nest site visit. The date, the observer, the answers to the various fields are all shown on here. And you are provided with a option of, if you find a mistake, of clicking the yellow edit button to change an answer, or if you decide that, hey, this thing is just really hosed, I'm just going to go ahead and delete it and start all over again. You can do that by clicking the delete button. If you check your answers and everything's fine, then the blue button to the left, click that, it takes you to a new blank form if you're going to add another form or multiple forms. And just like was the case last year, fields that are not filled in, when you save the form, are not going to be captured in this form. So you lose the ability to go back and enter data in a field that you forgot to fill in. So this would be a case where if I had critical information that I forgot to fill in and the field's not there, what I do is I just click delete the form and start all over and make sure that when I get to that field where I wanted that critical information to appear, that I put it in. The question marks near the field labels you can put your cursor over there and that will give you some additional help or explanation for what should be in the field. Okay. Based on experience from last year and previous years, you see this field called comments. It really doesn't hurt, but what the intent of this comment field is just to get a quick synopsis of what happened during the observation period. Like, I saw one adult eagle, the nest was occupied, the nest blew down, something like that, and put the detailed information if you wanted to include times of various activities. You can put that in later on down on the data form in the other information to BEW. And that's really the place where we prefer that you put those detailed descriptions and noteworthy observations in that field. Okay. So you check the answers here and have an opportunity to correct them if a correction is needed. Now let's go to the next slide, please. So assuming you had a correction that you needed to make, like, gee, I didn't get the right date in there, or I accidentally put in the wrong nest site, you can click on the edit button and it'll take you to this view. And here, once again, it shows you every field for which you provided information and gives you the opportunity to click on it and change that information or answer. Once you've made all the changes that you want, click the green Save Changes button. And when you do that, the changes will be saved and it'll take you back to your completed answer sheet so you can check it again. Next slide, please. Okay, another feature I want to divert away from the entering the data sheet to the next part of the overall tool, and that is looking at information that's already in the database or just checking nests that have been receiving reports. And that you do that by going to the data tab and looking to make sure that the observations tab is blue. This is the default field when you click on the data tab. So once you submit a record, or if you are just curious about what's going on in Nest in your areas or Nest overall, you can go to this two tabs and bring up this sheet or this page, and it shows you the date the nest was observed, what the nest name is, who did it, and you can click the view button to see that data sheet. Since there are over 8,300 observations in the database, and those are observations that have been collected since 2016, you might find it more convenient to use the search box there, in which you can just type in the nest code, for example, gold 2, or you can type in the nest code plus the nest name. And what that will do is filter all the records and show you just the records for that particular nest location. So let's go to the next slide, please. The other feature that's available, that if you're curious about the bald eagle nest, is you can go through the data tab and you can click on the locations tab and it'll bring up this screen. And the default display is it will show all the nests that are in the database with the first nest in the alphabet, and there are about 228 locations. So, unless you want to scroll through all of those, you can take a short and go to the search tab and just type in the nest code, and then it will display the nest. It'll display that nest, show you how many observations there are. For this particular situation, there are 200, and then you can click on view, see what all those observations. So let's go to the next tab, or next slide, please. And when you do that, it'll bring up the total list of reports or observations for a specific nest location. And from that list, you can scroll down the date observed on the left-hand side, see who it was observed by, and you can click on the view button over to the right, and that will bring up the nest report that you can review and get some information or help you understand what's going on at that particular nest location. Next slide, please. I'd like now to switch to the Google Groups. Many of you are familiar with this. This is an area where we can exchange information, pose questions, describe interesting observations that we saw, identify issues if there are issues and that sort of thing, and generally describe maybe what you saw during a particular nest location. I want to reemphasize here, this is for just general discussion, and observations that you may make and describe here are not saved into our database. So I'm strongly encouraged, in addition to going and describing general things here, please create a record in the SITSI information database that records that information, particularly for key events that have been described before, like start of incubation, first appearance of a new eaglet, the nest was destroyed, the nest has been abandoned and seems to no longer be active. Those key events are things that are nice to describe here, but really, really would serve a better purpose and be more beneficial to science if they are described in the SITSI website database. One thing that has occurred with this design on the Google site is the resource information that formerly used to show very clearly as a drop-down list has now been scrunched down to a narrow window that you need to scroll through. And if you scroll through there, you'll see these entries on the right-hand side. And the most valuable information for new volunteers and for volunteers that are going to look at a new nest are going to be the data entry guidelines, the 2022 nest descriptions and location sheets, and that's the place where we have posted a description of each nest in the inventory, which I'll show you an example of here in the next slide. And then we are going to be posting a map, updated map, statewide basis of all the nest locations to replace the entry that we see there, map of 2020 bald eagle nest locations. So that'll go away and we'll put in a map of the 2022 bald eagle nest locations. So if you're traveling around the state or you are just curious about what nests are located near you, you'll be able to open that map up and see where there are nest locations and what the nest codes for those locations are. And then we can work out a nest assignment if you want to start monitoring one or more of those locations. Or if you happen to be traveling out to Jackson Reservoir and you want to see if there are any nests around there that you want to stop and take a quick look at, that's where you would use that map and sheet description to locate that nest and take a look at it in the field and fill out a nest report when you get back. Next slide, please. Oh, wait a minute. Look, can we go back just a minute?
Yeah.
Can we go
Oops.
back? Okay. Yeah, I think I saw a little thing pop up on the screen. How do you get to this site?
Yep.
Look up in the upper right-hand corner, and there is the URL for getting to the Google's Bald Eagle Watch forum site. And it's best to just type that into your browser. But remember, you need to be given access to that site in order to open it up. So all of you that are returning from last year, whose credentials are still valid, you should be able to get to that now. If for some reason you can't, please send me or Matt or Meredith an email and we'll get the issue worked out. So next slide, please. So getting back to the nest site description and location sheet, this is an example. If once you click on that 2022 nest descriptions location sheet link on the previous page, it'll bring you to the new page where all the nests are listed there, as you see on the left-hand side of this screenshot. They're listed in alphabetical order by nest code, and what you would do, for example, if you wanted to look at the bar 8 2021 revised information, you just click on that and it will load a PDF file, which is generally 4 pages long. It's got 3 pages of location information, 1 page which shows you the photograph of the nest tree and the nest and the general setting for that nest. So those photographs also have a brief caption that say, this is the view if you look at it from Weld County Road X looking east. So hopefully that gives you the information. If you are really interested in looking at a nest but can't seem to find it, go to this source or send me an email and I will help you locate that nest so you can start monitoring it and provide observations on it. Next slide, please. Just a couple of pointers I want to re-emphasize. This is a carryover from last year. Make sure your nest names are correct. There are a lot of similar sounding names. For example, in the first one, I have Bar Lake North nest versus Bar Lake North 2 nest. Well, if I see, now the current situation is neither one of those nests exist anymore. Both nests have blown down, and there's a new nest that's being created this spring called Bar Lake North 3. So if I were to go through just doing QC and I see an entry for this year for either one of those 2, I'm going to know that's automatically an error, and then I'll get back with the observer and confirm that the nest they were looking at was really Bar Lake North 3. So once again, be sure you get those nest names checked. In terms of alternate nest, some of these breeding pairs have alternate nests. Example shown there on the right-hand side, that's the O'Brien Canal nesting pair with the primary active nest on the left and an alternate nest to the right. And that particular pair has been using that nest on the left for the last couple of years unsuccessfully, and the nest on the right is gradually deteriorating. So if I see, for example, a report that the bald eagle are using the nest on the right, I know that that's probably not correct, and we'll follow up with the volunteer to work out and to see, in fact, what nest was actually being reported on. So as many of you who have looked at some of these breeding pairs know, they have particular characteristics that are unique to them in terms of how they come into the nest, how they sit on the nest, and so forth when they begin nesting. There are some eagle pairs that are notorious early nesters, and there are some that are notorious late nesters. So if you are unfamiliar with a particular nesting pair, just pay attention to how the pair are behaving at the nest and adjust your observations and your conclusions about what's going on at the nest accordingly. And as you get into the incubation season, know that some of these nests are very tough to determine whether incubation is occurring or not, because the nest is large, the nest bowl is deep, and the incubating eagle scrunches down. So sometimes you may not see much more than the very, very top of the head. So I just want to emphasize that in those situations, look hard and maybe take a look at several different viewpoints at the nest to make your final determination. In cases where you're having difficulty looking at the nest or finding the nest or determining what's going on, I'd suggest you give us an email and we can give you pointers on where to look from to get the best view for determining what's going on at a particular nest. Okay. Next slide, please. Last but not least, I think some of you may be participating in the King Supers / City Mart Community Rewards. I just want to take a minute to remind you that you can benefit the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies by participating in the Community Rewards and the Amazon Smile program. And there's no cost to you. And basically what happens here is just by virtue of you shopping at these businesses, the businesses have methods for donating part of a pot of money they donate to nonprofit organizations and charities. And it's proportional to the amount of money that you spend at, patronizing their business. So, and last year with the King Supers City Market, I think Bird Conservancy of the Rockies received about $1,900, and that was in 2020. So if you weren't aware of this, think about it, and the process for signing up and participating is listed there on the slide. So let's see, next slide, please. So that brings me to the end of my thoughts and discussions. So now's the time for any questions or comments, suggestions. And once again, I just want to emphasize, if you have been having issues with SITSI or want to know how to do something with SITSI, I think we have a few minutes now that we could quickly address that. So turn it back to you, Meredith.
Okay, thanks. I am going to stop the screen sharing and invite anybody who'd like to unmute themselves or unvideo or start the video, and we can see you and you can ask questions directly, or you can type questions into the chat box, whichever way you prefer. What is that in the chat box? Oh, here's one. If a bald eagle is going to be tagged, that is one that I observed, would it be possible to observe the process?
I can answer that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have tried to communicate with the volunteer if I know who that person is ahead of time. Just be aware that sometimes it takes like 10 tries before we actually succeed in trapping a particular bird, and some we never succeed in actually trapping. And so generally at the time when the trap is actually set, it's just the contractor. His name is Mike Lockhart. He's a retired Fish and Wildlife Service employee. So he's usually the only person out at that time because we don't want a bunch of disturbance at the time when the trap's actually being set. But then after that, if you want to observe from a distance, that's totally fine. And in a lot of cases, if I have your number ahead of time, we can send you a text message if we actually catch a bird, because the bird is in hand for a while. So you've probably got a little bit of time to get over there once the bird is in hand. It's kind of a process to make sure that the transmitter is in exactly the right spot. It's just tight enough and not too tight in the harness, and that has that's been a good opportunity for us to get a hold of people who want to observe.
Great, thank you. This is a question, and I'm not sure whether it's coming from a new person or a continuing person. How soon can we start monitoring nests?
Yeah, let me,
Yeah, go for it.
this is Bruce. Can you hear me?
Yep.
If you're already a registered volunteer, you can start your observation today. What we've been encouraging is that registered volunteers monitor nest all year round, because what we're finding is that the additional observations are giving us and the Parks and Wildlife people additional information that helps them guide development plans and permit processes to minimize disturbance to eagles. So even if you started back in November or December or earlier this month, and you were just casually kind of looking at a nest and say, oh, there's nothing there, that observation, recording it in SITSI does have usefulness because it helps establish the timing of when nesting begins or the timing when activities can go on around the nest without disturbing eagles. And it may not be all that useful today, but when combined with the historical information, starts to show patterns that you can put more reliability on how the eagles are going to behave or when they're going to be in the area and so forth. So this is related to another question here that said, how do we record time in a nest when we look at the nest and there's no eagle there? Yes, do record that observation as seeing 0 adults, 0 nestlings, 0 fledglings. Create that nest site visit, and by virtue of creating that nest site visit, you will be giving the opportunity down in the hours donated to log in the time that you spent making that observation and processing the information. So yeah, that's encouraging you to record that observation even if you don't see any eagles.
Right, and that kind of goes back to something I said this morning, is that 0 is an important number. You know, we want zeros to confirm, you know, whether a nest is active or inactive. Having an observation there saying that there's nothing observed is worth something.
Okay, let me go down to the next one. It says, do we contact you or me to get a nest assignment to change our previous assignment? Yes. Yep. Just send me an email, send me the circumstances. If you want to do a nest assignment because you can't find one, or it's too far to travel, or there's not a convenient pull-off point to observe the nest, just describe those circumstances to me and I'll work with you to get you a reassignment. Next one is, how do we record times per nest when visiting multiple nests on a single observation trip? Okay, that's something I deal with all the time. And my recommendation is, if you're looking at 2 or more nests per observation trip, log in your start time, log in your end time, track how much total time is spent processing the data, and then take that sum of those different elements and just divide it by the number of nests that you visited. So if you visited 4 nests and it took you 8 hours total time to travel, to observe, to record the data, just divide that by 4 and you use 2 hours per nest in your observation report. Or if you're very meticulous, you can keep track of the time for each nest when you started and stopped, and travel time from one to the other, and add up all those increments and report it that way. Okay. Let's see. Let's see, I noted the first one.
So there's a question, does the SITSI tool support entering more than one observation at different times for the same day? And just to clarify, are you referring to more than one observation at different times for the same day for the same nest? Terry? Okay, so same nest, I'm assuming that based on drive-by, yep, okay.
Two reports.
So,
Two reports.
yep, separate reports. Separate observation or nest site visit reports.
Yep. And, you know, if it's only 5 minutes or a couple of minutes that you spend looking at that, when you can cover that or document that when you enter in your start and stop times for your nest observations. And there's nothing to prevent you from putting in a 5-minute or a 3-minute kind of observation duration.
We just recommend that observation times are longer than that, but if these are quick checks and you're recording something, then it might as well go in, especially since you're also doing a long observation. You know, you're getting that longer time that we're looking for in terms of the length of the observation, but data is data and we want it. So
Okay, I see a comment here that triggers a red flag. There's a note about, I use a notepad to document my time and observations with data tracking. Okay, something that we have observed in the past that people have made observations on a digital device and then copied and pasted that from their digital device into a data sheet. And that theoretically works well, except that in the course of doing your note taking, if you take or use hard stops like a paragraph break or an enter, you know, to maybe list times on your notes, if you copy and paste that into a data sheet, that causes problems when we go to process the data. So if you are, say, have a long description of behaviors for an eagle, just use periods and commas and semicolons. Don't use paragraph breaks or hard stops, because that in the database will tend to create or try to create a new record.
and
So-
I see, sorry, Bruce, I just wanted to address something real quick. Danny was just noted that this would be on a actually notebook paper and pen and notebook paper
Okay,
that she was referring to.
okay. Well,
Just to clarify, but your point
Yep.
stands. Yeah.
because I tried to do that and it's caused me all kinds of problems. So that's why I'm sensitive to it.
Sure. And I was going to say that if you're going to use pen and notebook paper, I would recommend to make sure that you're capturing all of the important data points to print off the data sheet that we have, the PDF data sheets. So those will be available on the CITSI group once you're invited to it, if you're not already. Yeah, that would be my recommendation, is to use those to make sure that you're capturing everything that needs to be captured.
I'm just looking down through the notes here, finally catching up with the 2 observations on the same day. If you still have that issue, please get in touch with me. And we'll have to get back to the programmer to see what might be causing that problem. Okay.
So there, Lois is asking about the CITSI app. I'm assuming she means the mobile app. So that's available on Apple and Android devices. Yes, and yeah, that connects directly to that same database. So it's basically a mobile version of citsi.org. So you can, the idea being that you could sit there on your iPhone or Android device and record the data on your phone while you're observing it, if you so choose.
And I see a comment from Catherine about the question about, do the grants fund you for volunteer travel time? If you're talking about them being able to use volunteer time as part of our match for our grants, yes, volunteer travel time absolutely does count. So anything pretty much that you're doing as part of your volunteer assignment, any of that time counts.
And then depending on the intent of that question, we don't reimburse volunteers for travel. So I'm not sure which way, what they meant with the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, there's no money, there's no actual money changing hands. This is-
However, mileage for your volunteering on your own personal vehicle can be written off at tax time. So just, I'm not a tax expert, so make sure you know what you're doing when you do that, but it can be done. Any other, yeah, thank you, Catherine. Any other questions? Any raised hands?
Oh, where will the recording of this be available? Actually, I am going to get the recording tomorrow or Monday, and I will send it out to everybody who registered for the training. Which means everybody on this call.
Yeah, and Cliff, I see your question about the trucks. So the trucks parked within 100 yards of the nest tree at Fossil Creek. If this is if it was sort of an existing use, if this truck parking area was in use for the, when the birds chose that site, then it's not technically outside of the guidelines, the CPW guidelines, as being an existing use. So if it's, Fort Collins natural area facilities, maintenance trucks or something like that, that had been parking there prior to the establishment of that nest, then they're sort of exempt from really being considered for those guidelines.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, then shred monster is what they're labeled. So it's certainly some landscaping operation, but it's behind a restricted gate. The
Yeah.
gate's usually closed, nobody can get in there. And then when they had the activity out on I-25 doing construction, there were all kinds of construction vehicles that were accessing that gate to get water out of the canal. To
Spray for dust or something like that.
yeah, whatever, But I also ran into a guy in a pickup truck that was doing observations at the request of the construction company to make sure the eagles weren't being affected, and they were ignoring all of this last year.
Yeah, so that sounds like they had they were basically following National Bald Eagle Management Guidelines and monitoring for
Right.
disturbance while they were operating within the buffer zone of the nest, which is good. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
All right. If we have no further questions, thank you, presenters. You were wonderful. Thank you, all you volunteers who are monitoring nests, and we look forward to having a great season with you. And with that, I am going to stop the recording and end the session.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.